I appreciate being invited to speak here. I was unacquainted with this group, never been among you before, although I've met Keith and Wendy in their home church a couple of times, and I guess that's the connection that got me invited here. The topic that is entitled Some Assembly Required, as Keith mentioned in his introduction, there is a longer treatment of this material at my website, which is thenarrowpath.com, and there's under the topical lectures, there's a lot of lectures there, as Keith said. He said there's literally thousands, not quite literally thousands. There's literally about 900 lectures at my website, but there are several hundred more of my lectures at other people's websites that aren't at my website. There's people who've recorded my lectures elsewhere, and they put them on their own website. So I don't know how many of my lectures are on the web, but they are not available for sale. You can just download them and listen to them. But the series, Some Assembly Required, was actually a series of lectures I gave when I lived in Idaho. And before I moved to Idaho, I was living in Oregon. And I was what we called between churches. Do you know that expression? I was between churches for several years. I got into trouble with a friend of mine who was a pastor. Not serious trouble, but he thought I was not adequately involved in church because I was between churches. What actually had happened, I had been for all my life in churches. I've been an elder in a number of churches in the past. I filled in as an interim pastor in a church for some time years ago. I've been in pastoral ministry a bit, and I've been in church all my life. I was raised in a Baptist church. I was converted as a child, and I've been in the ministry since I was 16. I actually began in the ministry here in Orange County, though I don't live in Orange County now. But I was going to Calvary Chapel from 1970, Calvary Chapel, Costa Mesa, from 1970 to 74. And if you were around in those days, you know that was the beginning of something exciting that was going on. And that I eventually moved further north into Santa Cruz, and then further north into Oregon, then further north into Idaho, and then I worked my way back. I'm in Santa Cruz again. Maybe this will be the next step back. But in Oregon, I ran a Bible college, if we could call it that, very small. Not many more students than we have in this room right now, but it was a 9-month program. I say a college because it wasn't, that was the level of training we had there, and we went through the whole Bible verse by verse in 9 months with new batch of students, an international group of students every year. I did that for 16 years, and it was during that time that I found myself between churches. I had been going to a church in McMinnville, Oregon, where our school was located, and they had a church split. This time I wasn't the cause, thankfully. I'm innocent of this. They had a split between older people and younger people in the church, and I was neither. I was middle-aged. But the older people who had been there forever and built the church, and then their children who were younger, had a conflict in worship styles and so forth. The church split. They went two different ways, and I went with neither group. I was actually sympathetic toward the older group in some ways, but the younger people were more of my friends, and I just didn't want to alienate anyone, so I thought we'll just look for another church. But about that time, the chaplain at George Fox University, which was near McMinnville, Oregon, it's in Newburgh, 15 miles away, called me and asked if I would like to fill a pulpit on the Oregon coast for a while in a church that was just starting up. It wasn't much bigger than this group, and they were meeting in some kind of in a little Oregon coastal town. And they wanted someone to come every other week to preach, and so I was available. And so every other Sunday, I made this 2-hour trip to the coast to preach for these people. Well, when you're between churches and every other week you're driving 2 hours to preach in a church, it's hard to really get established in a new church in your own locality. So I wasn't worried about that, but some people were. Some people thought I'm not adequately churched. I'm not accountable to a legitimate church. And actually, during that time, because I used to be in music ministry. I don't do that much anymore, but when I was younger, I was. There was this Christian organization that wanted to manage unknown Christian music talent and get them booked in different churches and so forth, and they wanted to work with me. And so I filled out an application for them, and they asked who my pastor was. Well, I didn't have a local pastor in my area, and so I gave the pastor of a church in California, who was my best friend and who had been a pastor of mine years earlier. And they got back to me and said, there's a bit of a problem here. You live in Oregon, and you said you're pastoring a church in California. Don't you have a local church you go to? And I said, well, yes, I go to quite a few local churches, as a matter of fact. I go to several. And they said, well, but where are you accountable? I said, well, like all Christians, I'm accountable to God. Doesn't the Bible say we'll all give account of ourselves to God? And he said, but what structure of accountability do you have locally? I said, well, I'm not sure what a structure of accountability is supposed to look like, but I lead a Bible school. We continue daily in the apostles' teaching and fellowship and prayers and breaking bread, since the students all live together in a student community, and we pray together, we study the Word together, we eat together, we do everything together. And on Sundays, I even go to church somewhere, usually, even preaching once in a while. And they said, but who are you accountable to? I said, well, the school has a board of directors. Does that count? We meet once a year. And they said, no, that's not good enough. You need to have a pastor in your life. I said, well, I actually, twice a week, I meet for breakfast with 2 local pastors who are my friends. They said, that's not good enough. You have to join a church. I said, listen, I have accountability every which way you look. I'm in fellowship every day. We hold a public meeting at our school on Friday nights where I preach and people from the community come. I meet with pastors for breakfast twice a week. I preach every other week in a church, and I fellowship all over town. Now, what is it I'm lacking here? They said, you need to be a member of a church. I said, do you mean that if you would be satisfied if I just went to the biggest church in town and became a regular part of that church, and the pastor didn't know me really at all, but I was there, you'd consider that I was adequately accountable because I was in a church? And they said, well, that's about it. I said, well, I don't think we'll be working together, because that's not how I see church. And what happened is, because we didn't have a local church in our town, a friend of mine said, why don't we start meeting in a home? And so I started meeting in his home. Well, I have a radio program, and I did even back then. This was back in the 90s. And a number of people who heard me on the radio would say, where do you go to church? And I said, well, I kind of go to a house church. And they said, can we go? So eventually there were about 10 families going to this house church. And they were big families because they were homeschooling, no birth control type families. And so it was a big church. Only 10 families, big for a home. Well, we met like that for 2 years, and we had literally no structure. And it was one of the best church experiences we'd ever had. We had no official leader. The people came there because they'd heard me on the radio, but I didn't lead the meetings. We were hosted in another guy's house. I figured it's his house, let him host it. And all the heads of families were mature Christian men, so it didn't make any sense to pick someone to lead them. It just seemed artificial. You got 10 mature Christian couples, and if we said, well, let's pick out 3 to be the leaders. Well, wouldn't that be kind of arbitrary? What would these 3 have going for them that the other 7 don't have going for them? It'd just be artificial. So we never even thought of doing that. It never occurred to us. We just had an all-day meeting on Sundays where we ate a meal and sang songs together, and no one gave a sermon. And I'm a teacher. I'm a full-time teacher, but I never taught in that meeting one time because I taught all week. I didn't want to teach there too. And we just would have fellowship. And typically the women, of course, would get together and talk about the things they wanted to talk about. And the men would talk about things they wanted to talk about. But the men and women could be together. It was just so free. There was no structure. And it was so edifying. And we got so bonded together that eventually I closed the school in Oregon. I was invited to go out to teach regularly at a church in Idaho, near Grangeville, Idaho. And this was a church that had started as a home church also, where 2 men, heads of households, had been going to a very legalistic church of a sort of an Anabaptist cast. I don't know if you've heard of Charity Fellowship. It's okay if you haven't. They're a movement around the country, but they they're, of course, homeschooling and that kind of a group, but they're very legalistic about a lot of issues. And these people have been going there, and all the women at that church had to wear head coverings. Well, these two guys, their wives didn't wear head coverings. And they're rather brazen about it. They just didn't feel that was necessary, and they were, pleased to not fit in that way. They didn't. Some might say they were being a little more rebellious than they should be, but they just thought maybe these people can accept us as we are or not. Well, they kind of felt like it was not, and so they were talking. The two men were talking on a Saturday in one of their homes, and one of them was the postmaster of the town, and the other was just a rancher. And the rancher said to the postmaster said to the rancher, he said, "Where are you going to church tomorrow?" And the rancher said, "I'm coming here to have church with you in your house." And so these two families arrived, but not only them. Before morning, several other families heard about it. There were like 4 or 5 families the first day, and then it grew bigger to 10, 12 families. Eventually, there were too many families, and so they eventually rented a little chapel at a Christian campground nearby. And they met there, and there were other house churches around that heard about it, and they wanted to fellowship together too. So all these house churches got together this meeting on Sundays. And that was the group that invited me to come and be a part of them. Well, it was really great. The church had no name, no creed, just the Bible, no official leadership, no building, no staff. It was just an organic gathering of people. All of them had been in house churches, and now it was like 5 or 6 house churches now in one building, and they were really great. I mean, the chapel had a box in the back for offerings, but it didn't belong to these people. It belonged to the chapel at this campground. But people would put money in it, and a lot of money, because these people didn't have anywhere else to give their gifts. Right. And so they'd take the money, and all the brothers would get together on Tuesday nights to decide what should be done with the money. It was always to help someone who was poor in the group. All the money went to help the poor. One of the most wonderful things that happened there was that one of the young families had moved to the area, and they just had enough money to buy a bare piece of land, but they had no house, so they're living in a camp trailer with their 3 kids. And so one weekend, the whole church, everyone, went up to their property and built a house for them. Wow. With the church funds that had come in, it was like an Amish barn raising. In one weekend, they laid the foundation before the church people arrived. So, the guy and some others had built a foundation. And we all went up there and raised a house in one weekend. And it was a cute house, and the man who lived in it was able to fix it up inside more afterwards, but we got it, dried in and stuff. So that was just a really great church. All the money went to paying the rent or the mortgage for people who didn't have enough, and it was a depressed area. I love that place. But what happened, this series on Some Assembly Required came out of my teaching there. Actually, the 10 families in Oregon that I was meeting with, when I told them I was moving to Idaho, they moved there too. Wow. 7 of the 10 families uprooted and went to Idaho also. That might make me seem like a cult leader. I didn't invite them, and they didn't live on a compound with me. In fact, the church was scattered over a whole county, Idaho County, which is the size of the state of New Jersey. But the whole county has 15,000 people in it. So 15,000 people spread over a county the size of New Jersey, and these people were spread all over the place, but they'd all come together on Sundays. And my friends who moved from Oregon, they all got property wherever they could get it, so they were spread out too. And we didn't see each other any more often than we saw the other people in the church, pretty much, but we were all there. Now, and the reason this series arose is because there was always somebody coming along saying, this church has been together for 3 years, there's 150 people in it, and we don't even have any leaders. We don't even have a statement of faith. We don't even have a name. It's embarrassing when people say, where do you go to church? We just say, well, we go to the church down there at that campground. And so people were always trying to pressure some people within the group, but they were usually being pressured from people outside who were critical. Well, you don't have a real church until you have membership and tithing and leaders, elders, and so forth. And so this was always coming up, should we get more, what I would say, institutional? And since I was teaching every Tuesday night, I decided to teach a series to discourage that trend. And that series was Some Assembly Required. Now, that is a lot of hours of lecture, and I've already used up 15 minutes in my hour here. So I've given you these notes because they have, as you can see, there's a lot of points on both sides of the sheet, and there's a lot of scriptures, and I will not be looking at all of those here. We do talk about all those scriptures and look them up in the lecture series, but just to kind of go quickly as a light touch to the whole topic, we are probably all aware of the difference, at least some of the differences, between the primitive church in Jerusalem, described in Acts chapters 2 through 4, or through 5, and church as we know it today. I think we in this room especially, because you people are part of the Orange County Organic Church Forum, I assume, or at least you're here because you have some interest or some awareness of alternative ideas about what church is supposed to be. And usually people get interested in that because they become aware. They just realize, wait a minute, church as I've been doing it, the only way I've known of church in America has been a certain way, but I read in the book of Acts it's not really that way at all. I read in the epistles of Paul, it's not that way at all. How do we get here from there? And it's important that we look at that, because if you're not among those who have given this consideration before, you typically are likely to read the book of Acts chapters 2 through 4 and just kind of wedge it into the paradigm of church you already know. Typical of this is when people, and you hear preachers say this on the radio all the time, Timothy was the pastor of the church in Ephesus. The Bible makes no reference to Timothy or anybody else being a pastor of a church. There's no church in the New Testament that had a pastor, as far as we can tell from what the Bible says. It doesn't ever talk about a church having a pastor. When the churches had official leaders, they were called elders, and there were several in each congregation. Paul and Barnabas appointed elders in every congregation on their first missionary journey. And, of course, we know from the book of Titus that Paul wrote to Titus and said that he should appoint elders in every congregation on the island of Crete where there were Christians. Timothy also was apparently involved in appointing elders, also in a church that had been in long standing in Asia, in Ephesus. Though there does appear to be evidence that there were churches in Paul's time where he didn't even appoint any leaders. And even John, when John writes 3 John, he writes about Diotrephes, who loves to have the preeminence, and don't follow his example, follow Demetrius. He's got a good report with everybody. Be like him. It's like John doesn't say, just obey the pastor or just obey the elders. He talks about individuals in the church who have some kind of visibility. He says, this is a good guy to follow. This is not a good guy to follow. It seems like it'd be so simple just to say, Demetrius is your pastor, Diotrephes is a heretic, but they didn't do that. Now that did begin to happen in the 2nd century. We see evidence of that in the letters of Ignatius, because Ignatius, by the time he wrote, about 115 to 120 AD, the churches in his area at least all had what they called a bishop. And he said, you can't baptize without the bishop present, you can't have marriage ceremonies, you can't take communion, you can't do much of anything without the bishop present. Now, the word bishop, in the New Testament, we have it in the King James Version and some other versions, the word bishop. That's the word episkopos, which means overseer. Epi in the Greek is over. Skopos, you could guess what skopos means. See, like telescope, microscope, skopos. Episkopos means an overseer. Unfortunately, since the King James Version was translated by Anglicans or Congregationalists in England, the leader of the church they knew was the bishop, the guy with the pointy hat. And so when the translators translated the King James, they came to the word episkopos, they used the word bishop, which sounds very ecclesiastical. Whereas the word overseer sounds more functional, someone who's looking over things, who's keeping an eye on things. But the word overseer or episkopos in Paul's writings and in Peter's, also Peter uses it too in 1 Peter 5, is used interchangeably with the word elder. That is, the elders were overseers, the overseers were elders, and there was only one office, if we could even call it an office. And there was one kind of recognized leaders in the local churches. And those were the men who were called elders and overseers. There were multiple in each church. There was never a church in the New Testament that we ever know about that had one man who was the bishop, the overseer, the elder, the pastor. And somebody said, doesn't the Bible say that the Lord gave some pastors to the church? In Ephesians 4:11, he gave some apostles, some prophets, some evangelists, some pastors and teachers. Yeah, that's the only place in the New Testament where the word pastor is used of anyone other than Jesus or a regular shepherd of real sheep. The word pastor, poimen in the Greek, means a shepherd. Right. And Jesus is called the great poimen, the great shepherd. And of course, the guys who heard the angels sing about Jesus at his birth in Bethlehem, they were shepherds. They're called poimen also. The Bible mostly uses the word to speak of men who actually lead livestock. And then secondly, Jesus. And one time, the noun is used of church leaders. And it's only in Ephesians 4:11 where it says, he gave some pastors, or he gave some shepherds. Right. Now, it doesn't say how many per flock, or how many per congregation. But we know from what Paul said in Acts chapter 20, when he called the elders of the church of Ephesus to meet with him at Miletus on his way to Jerusalem, his final trip there, he said to them, shepherd the flock of God, over which the Holy Spirit has made you overseers. That is, you elders are bishops, overseers. And he says, shepherd, it's the verb form of appointment. Be the shepherd, be the pastor. So the elders were doing the pastoral work, and there were several of them in each congregation. We don't know of a group that had one. Now, why do people say Timothy was a pastor? Well, because the things that Timothy was told to do are things that in our modern churches, pastors are thought to, the senior pastor is supposed to do, supposedly. Timothy was an apostle, and apostles were rather unusual. They weren't, they weren't stationary local leaders. Sometimes they settled in an area for a while. Paul, for example, settled in Corinth for 18 months and in Ephesus for about 3 years. But he didn't belong to one location. He belonged to the whole church. And so did Timothy. Timothy is called an apostle in 1 Thessalonians, and to call him a pastor is to not really quite recognize what his real role was in the early church. But in the local churches, when they appointed leaders at all, they were called elders, and there were elders in every church. Elders, plural. Remember when James says, is any sick among you? Let him call for the elders, plural, of the church, singular. And let them pray over them, anoint them with oil in the name of the Lord, and so forth. That's typical. In fact, in Philippians 1:1, why don't we look at Philippians 1:1 just for a moment? This is an interesting thing that I noticed some years ago, actually back in the 70s. It's been a while. In Philippians 1:1, how Paul addresses this letter to the Philippians. He says, Paul and Timothy, bondservants of Jesus Christ, to all the saints in Christ Jesus who are in Philippi, with the overseers and deacons. Why didn't he say hello to the pastor? Isn't that rude of him? He writes to all the saints and their deacons and their overseers, their elders. But he doesn't even say hi to the pastor. What's up? Because there was no pastor there except for the overseers themselves. The elders are the pastors. They do the pastoral work. Not only did Paul say that to the elders of Ephesus in Acts chapter 20, but Peter said the same in 1 Peter 5. When he begins that chapter, the elders who are among you, I exhort, who am also an elder and a witness of the sufferings of Christ and partaker of the glory that shall follow. He says, shepherd the flock of God, taking the oversight of it. Again, he refers to the elders as the overseers, the shepherds. So in the early churches, there were men, in most cases, in most churches, there were men who provided some form of leadership. And they could be called elders, which in presbyteroi in the Greek just means an old man. It's actually the ordinary word for an old man. Whenever you want to talk about an old man, you use presbyteros. That's what they called the leaders of the church. They were probably just some of the men who were had seniority, they were older. They were more mature. And so people would look to them like older brothers. And remember, it is like older brothers, not like fathers. Remember when Jesus said to his disciples, don't call anyone father. Don't call anyone teacher. You have one Father who's in heaven. You have one teacher, the Christ. You are all brothers. Right. And he said that to the apostles. You're just all brothers. That's all. This is just a family. This is not a religious hierarchy here. This is a family. Everybody's brothers and sisters. You don't call somebody by some kind of reverend or whatever. You know, the show I do on the radio is a Bible question and answer show. And back in the 70s, when I was in Orange County, not only did Walter Martin start a program like that, but another man whose name I will not give started a program like that. He had 8 earned degrees. He was a very knowledgeable man. He wrote many books, some of which I've read with profit. He's written good books. He's quite a scholar. I never met the man, although I've heard from people who went on tours with him. He was a little cranky, and I think he was, because he had a show sort of like Walter Martin's Bible Answer show in the 70s. And people would call it and they'd say, hello, brother so-and-so. And he'd say, that's Dr. so-and-so. He said, I spent a lot of time to earn these degrees. I have the right to be called doctor. That's when I changed the channel. Don't let anyone call you rabbi or doctor. Or certainly reverend is a strange title to call a human being. And yet we do. Now, I'm not legalistic about that. I mean, if a pastor is used to be calling pastor so-and-so, I'll call him pastor so-and-so. I don't think it's going to go to his head. I mean, it's just it's a polite way that people talk to him. But that's not really what the early church was like. And some of the churches apparently didn't have any appointed leaders at all. Like I mentioned, the church that had Diotrephes and Demetrius in it that John wrote to in 3 John. There apparently were no official leaders in that church at all. In the Thessalonian church, when Paul wrote to them in 1 Thessalonians 5, around verse 12, he said, remember, honor those who take the lead among you. And he said, respect them for their work's sake, not for their office. You don't salute a uniform, not the position they hold, but for their work's sake. Esteem them highly for their work's sake. I'll give you the verse numbers because I'm just kind of paraphrasing there, and it's much better to give you the actual words. 1 Thessalonians 5:12, he says, we urge you, brethren, to recognize those who labor among you and are over you in the Lord, and who admonish you, and to esteem them very highly in love for their work's sake. So there were older Christians, not very much older in Thessalonica, because Paul had just done his evangelism there initially a few weeks before he wrote this. He was only there for 3 weeks before he got run out of town. And so there were 3-week-old Christians, but even among them, there were some who were more mature, probably some who had maybe a Jewish background, knew the law better, and more familiar with the Scripture, maybe the older people. But these people were like organic leaders in the group. They didn't have an office, it would appear. They just did a work. They served. They served as leaders. And this is the important thing to think, because when the church becomes institutionalized, it becomes political, and the leaders become political. And in the early church, Jesus said, it shall not be that way among you. Jesus said, you know that the rulers of the Gentiles exercise authority over them, but it shall not be done that way among you. He said that he would be chief among you must be the slave and the servant of all. So the persons who were the leaders weren't the ones who were giving orders. They were the ones who were serving and setting the best example. And for example, look at 1 Corinthians chapter 16. Paul wrote more pages to the Corinthians than to anybody else that we know of. Not only 2 long epistles that are in our Bible, he wrote at least one other epistle that's not in our Bible. He alludes to it in 1 Corinthians 5:9. He mentions an earlier epistle that we don't have. So he wrote at least 3. And some think there was another epistle between the 2 we have. There could have been as many as 4 epistles. This church received a lot of letters and writing from Paul, but one of the strange things is he never mentions the leaders in the church. That is, he didn't ever mention elders or overseers of that church. And that would have been a good place to do it because, you know, they were a troubled church. And one of their biggest troubles was divisions among them. I mentioned that Ignatius in the 2nd century had written letters to 7 churches, and he always mentions the bishop. Don't do anything without the bishop present. Now, that might sound very controlling. It sounds kind of creepy controlling to me, but the reason he gave was because there were divisions in those churches. That is, Ignatius was saying the church is seeing divisions, there's false teachers, there's division going on, people disagree with each other, and so he said, here's the solution. Submit to the bishop. Now that's the way churches think you're supposed to fix things, if there's division, if there's disagreement. Because people don't like disagreement. Remember Keith said when he was introducing me, he kind of likes to not be around people who are all just like him. But not everyone likes that. It's threatening. You don't think what I think? Well, I'll find some more people who do, because I don't feel real comfortable around people who don't think like I do. They might be right. If they are, I sure don't want to find out, because I might have to change my mind about something. Exactly. And so what the carnal way to deal with division in the church, and many pastors have done this over the years. They say, we're going to have unity in this church. That means everyone does what I say. Everyone conforms to me. And that's what Ignatius apparently was recommending. Now, Paul wrote to the Corinthians, and they had divisions. And he never said, submit to the bishop, submit to the elders. As far as we know, the church didn't even have elders. He never mentions them. What does he say to do? He says, recognize that you all belong to Christ. You're all one body. You're different from each other. Hands and feet and eyes and nose are different from each other. But they all need each other. You don't just bring conformity in order to have unity. Unity is not the same as uniformity. Right. Unity is loving people even in a non-homogeneous group of people. And love is spiritual. Authoritarian control is carnal. And it's easier to do the carnal thing, because by nature it's easier to be carnal than spiritual. So it's easier to say, listen, if you guys aren't going to agree with me, why don't you go start your own church? And we'll just keep meeting over here with the people who agree with me. Right. Instead, and that's why we have 4,000 denominations now. Certainly more than that, really, but that's a lot. There shouldn't be. Now, I realize that some groups are truly heretical enough that they probably are not, they went out from us because they were not of us, And yet not everything is that heretical. If people believe in infant baptism or, believer baptism, certainly one of those groups is wrong. But are they wrong in a way that they're not our brothers anymore, and that we just can't fellowship with them, can't love them anymore? Why? What's so threatening about that? Let them baptize their infants if they want. We'll baptize our believers if that's what we believe in. And who cares what someone thinks about when the rapture is going to be, or what the secrets of the mysteries of predestination are, or even how a person explains the Trinity. The Bible never explains the Trinity. Why do we make it an issue that people have to explain the Trinity the same way we do? Or else they belong somewhere else. These are not the issues that people in the early church fellowshipped under. Now, of course, in the early church in Jerusalem, they all had the same doctrine. They all had the same teachers. The apostles were teaching everybody. But once the church spread out all over the world, they didn't have the luxury of having an apostle in every church. And they had to learn to get along. And Paul would write to the Corinthians, and they've got divisions, and they've got all kinds of carnality. That's a place that's just rife for a solution like Ignatius had. Paul just said, I'm sending one of my guys in there. I'm sending one of my lieutenants in there, and he's going to rule this church with an iron hand until all these problems are solved, and everyone submit to him. Paul didn't do that. You know what he said? Look at 1 Corinthians 16 and verse 15. He says, I urge you, brethren, you know the household of Stephanas, that it is the first fruits of Achaia. Now, Achaia is the southern Greek peninsula, and that's where Corinth was. And he's saying the household of Stephanas, they were the first Christians there. They were the first ones who got saved in that area. And they're the oldest Christians in the church, in other words. He says, now they are the first fruits of Achaia. He says that they have devoted themselves to serving the saints. Your translation might say the ministry of the saints. So the word ministry means service. Yeah, they have devoted themselves to servanthood. These are the oldest Christians in your church, and they are servant-minded people. What's he say? He says that you must also submit to such as these, and to everyone who works and labors with us. Now, in other words, if Paul sends someone in to do stuff, they should submit to him. But he says, you've got the household of Stephanas right there. They're a mature Christian family. They are servant-hearted. Jesus said, "Who the chief among you is the one who's a servant of all." These people qualify. Submit to people like that. He doesn't say, and Stephanas I'm appointing to be the bishop. He didn't give the man an office. They were supposed to just recognize this man was doing what mature Christians do. He's a good example. You should let him, give you a clue how to be mature. The idea was not that there was a daddy and children in the church. God is the daddy, and everyone else is the children. But among the children of a large family, there are older and younger children. And in many cases, the younger children are smart enough to recognize that their older brother or brothers sometimes have more experience. I often think when I use this illustration of a family I know, an Italian family that I knew in Santa Cruz years ago, a big Italian family, and all the kids are adults. But the family was tight, and they'd get together as a family to kind of, I guess, decide things that affected them as a family. They're much more tighter knit than most American culture families are. And the dad was gone. The dad had left the family years earlier, so there were some older brothers. And in the family councils, because I sat in on some of these because I was good friends with the family, the older brothers would often would be the ones who made decisions about how they're going to solve a problem. Now, no one in the family was obligated to do what they said. They didn't hold some kind of official rank or office, but they were respected. They were men who had successful lives, successful marriages. They exhibited wisdom in their past, and the younger members of the family said, they just kind of listened to those people. And that's what I think Christian leadership was in the early church, initially. I don't think they had political officers in the churches. Even when they appointed elders, the word appointment, I think, speaks of a recognition of them. And I think they did it when they saw a need for it. Now, in Corinth, Paul apparently didn't feel there were enough mature Christians in Corinth. Remember, he told them how carnal and how babes they were in Christ. I don't think he felt like he could appoint an eldership in that church. But he knew one family that he could trust, but he's not going to make that one guy the leader of the church. One-man leadership was not what Paul had in mind for a church. So he just said, see him, see his family, look how they are. They serve the saints. They're devoted to serving the saints. When you see people like that, submit to people like that. Now, that's a totally different kind of submission than a political, hierarchical, top-down kind of a authority structure, which later developed, of course, obviously, in the 2nd century. And when that did, the church became institutionalized. Now, there's so many different things in my notes that I won't be able to get to. That's why I gave them to you. I knew I wouldn't. But I would like to point out something. If you look at the back side of the sheet, Roman numeral Roman numeral 4. This